Accused my dad's wife of faking cancer after her questionable behavior, and now our family is in turmoil. For context, my dad, 65, has been married 3 times. I'm 26, and my siblings Leo, 23M, and Vanessa, 24F, come from his first marriage. When I was 21, Dad married his third wife, Francine, also 65. From the beginning, Francine struck me as odd. For example, she wouldn't let our stepsister Hannah, 18F, drink juice, and I'd hear her make comments about Hannah's eating when Hannah was just 12 or 13. It wasn't until later that I learned Hannah was struggling at the time with self-harm and an eating disorder, and looking back, the things Francine did and said were basically fuel on an open fire. Francine, it seemed, never cared much about me, Vanessa, or Leo. That was fine with us. We were adults by the time she entered our lives. She'd show up at birthdays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, and give us a joint gift with Dad, but never went the extra mile. She'd leave early from our theater productions, miss rugby games, and, when she did talk to us, all she ever cared about was when we'd get married or have children. That was it, nothing else seemed to matter to her. And then there were her health problems. She'd always dramatically react to the scent of perfume, shampoo, or even cigarette smoke clinging to my clothes. My mom and grandma, who raised us, both smoked. Because of Francine's ever-changing allergies, corn syrup, red dye number 5, yogurt, peanuts, the list went on. My siblings and I barely saw my dad for years, just in case we accidentally sent Francine into anaphylactic shock. And yet, the same things she was so allergic to would turn up on the menu the next time I saw her. Fast forward to 2022, Francine was suddenly diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer in April, and we were told she had a year to live. Devastated for my dad, my siblings and I did everything we could to support him. Then, in December, my grandmother, my favorite person growing up, my second mom, was also diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. I had always been Grandma's favorite, her first grandchild, the one she babysat and shared a room with for years. After her diagnosis, I took a leave from work to care for her during hospice, and when she passed away in February, I absolutely unraveled. I nearly ended up in the hospital for relapsing into self-harm and had to double up on therapy just to keep myself together. Losing Grandma was a gut punch for my entire family. My sister went on medication, my brother started fighting for promotions at work, and I was trying to carve out a future with my long-term boyfriend. I also had to think about practical matters, like what would happen with my health insurance when I turned 26 and would no longer be covered under Francine's plan. Maybe this is where I become the villain in Francine's narrative. I texted her, asking when exactly I'd be off her insurance so I could prepare and not be left without coverage. Her response was an essay about having cancer, and how I only contacted her when I needed something. I'll admit, I snapped. I pointed out, let's face it, you are as interested in me as I am in you. You never reached out when my grandmother died, even though you knew how close we were. You didn't ask about me when my other grandmother died in early 2022. You don't know when I'm graduating from nursing school, or anything about my life, really. How dare you accuse me of anything when you've never put in the effort? Be an adult and admit it, we aren't friends, let alone family. The phone works both ways, and if you wanted to have a relationship with me, you should have tried when I was 21. Privately, I confessed to my siblings, my mother, friends, and boyfriend, I don't think Francine has cancer at all. That suspicion first surfaced with my mother, then my boyfriend. Both said the same thing, completely independently. Francine said she was allergic to chemo and was supposedly treating her cancer with coffee enemas and juice cleanses. She told us she'd had surgery, but I never saw a scar. Here's the thing, she and my grandmother were diagnosed with the same thing, but over a year later, Francine wasn't wasting away, she was taking a month-long trip to upstate New York and Canada with my dad. She even sent us a photo, and she looked healthy as ever. I flat out asked Leo and Vanessa if they believed Francine actually had cancer. Leo admitted it was suspicious, while Vanessa just asked, why would Dad lie to us? I pointed out that Dad never actually goes to Francine's medical appointments. He always just reports what Francine says, and when we dig deeper, he dodges the questions or just sighs and shakes his head. Recently, Hannah reached out and apologized for her mother's behavior, admitting that even she has no idea what Francine's issues are. Now Francine is trying to convince my dad and Hannah to move with her to upstate New York because the air is healthier for her healing process. But this time, both my dad and Hannah have told her flat out that they won't go. All of this makes me feel even more strongly that Francine is manipulating my dad and our entire family. I'm not angry because she married my dad, it's not a bitter evil stepmother complex. In fact, my parents' divorce was the best thing they could have done for us, and I even really liked my dad's second wife. I've never resented either of my parents for dating or remarrying. But with Francine, it's different, there's just something wrong. She's constantly using her health as a weapon in our family dynamics, and I'm sick of it. She doesn't care about us, but holds things like insurance over our heads and threatens to take us all off it. Myself, my siblings, even my dad. There's so much more, I can't possibly remember it all, but the bottom line is this. Francine's behavior is beyond suspicious, and I have to wonder if anyone else could ever see her the way I do. Update 1. My dad and Francine went through one of the ugliest divorces I've ever witnessed, a situation so chaotic it left my father completely homeless. It was only after everything fell apart that Francine's lies truly came to the surface. She confessed that she owed over $60,000 in alimony to her ex, and he was actually taking the house where she, my dad, and my sister lived. As if that wasn't enough, the week of Thanksgiving last year, she kicked both my father and my sister out, leaving them with nowhere to go, homeless, until this past August. Even if I wanted to, I just didn't have the means to help them. It was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Francine's behavior was like something out of a bad movie. She broke off the key in the lock to keep them from getting their things, stole a bunch of money from my dad, bought a house in New York under his name, and absolutely torpedoed his credit. The level of pettiness and cruelty she displayed is almost hard to describe, and there are so many other disgusting details I could share. As for those who wondered if she was lying about having cancer, yeah, she's still alive, she was questioned about it, and she's perfectly fine. No crisis there, just more deception. Watching my dad realize that everything Francine said was a lie was absolutely devastating. In my eyes, she destroyed him, tore his life apart piece by piece, and left him to pick up the scraps. That shook me deeply. Now, I'm officially in my clinicals, working harder than ever and hoping to wind up in pediatric oncology after graduation. I think about my grandmother all the time. There are so many things I wish I could talk to her about, so many moments I wish she were here for. Sometimes it feels like the only way through this chaos is to focus on the future, and do everything I can to build a better one. Update 2. I thought the worst was behind us until a certified envelope showed up in my mailbox with my dad's name on it, a notice of default on a mortgage for a house in the Catskills he owned. He held it for a long time like it might disappear if he stared hard enough and finally said, "I didn't buy a house." Watching a grown man realize he's been living inside someone else's story is a particular kind of grief. We drove to the county clerk because the bank wouldn't even talk to him without verifying ownership. The deed had his name typed cleanly, the mortgage was through a lender he'd never heard of, and the notary stamp was from Florida while the closing was supposedly in New York. The signature wasn't remotely his. My dad's handwriting looks like a spider broke both legs. This was round and neat and, if you squinted, looked exactly like Francine's, just signed with his name. The clerk slid a piece of paper across the counter like she'd done it 100 times and gave us the number for the DA's title fraud unit. A detective called that afternoon. He didn't treat my father like an idiot who got taken. He said words like forgery and grand larceny and asked for texts, emails, anything that tied Francine to New York. Turns out the notary had already been flagged in another case. My dad gave a handwriting sample, an affidavit, and then someone from the bank sat on our thrift store couch while Hannah emptied a shoebox from a storage unit Francine stopped paying for. It was all there, the bones of the lie. Insurance paperwork from when I was still on her plan, a year and change with not a single oncology claim. No chemo, no immunotherapy, no PET scans. Just wellness visits and a lot of integrative medicine billing codes, printed detox protocols with highlighted coffee enema schedules, emails to a healer about maintaining the narrative with adult children, that wording will sit in my throat forever, and 2 drafts of the same fundraiser under different names, toggling between late-stage lung cancer and advanced autoimmune disease like she was shopping for the right tragedy. She'd pulled in thousands the year my grandmother was actually dying. I had to leave the room and stand on the porch because I felt like my skin didn't fit. The detective took the box. He told my dad, calmly, that they were building a case, wire fraud if they could tie the fundraiser to the false diagnosis, forgery on the deed, theft by deception for the money she borrowed and never returned. I'm not used to people in offices caring about my family, hearing, "Sir, this wasn't your fault," from someone who could actually do something about it. Nodded something. In my dad I couldn't reach with 100 conversations. He cried and didn't try to hide it. He said, "I knew when she didn't lose her hair," and then he looked at me and said, "I didn't say it because if I said it, it made it real." Francine must have felt the ground shifting because she started with the late-night texts. "You don't understand what stress does to cancer. Intuitive surgery saved me. When you sign the papers I can start treatment again." That line made my dad actually laugh, not because anything about this is funny, but because the spell was gone. He blocked her. He and Hannah went to court and got a protective order. He met with legal aid, pulled his credit, called every number on every fraud alert. It was tedious, humiliating, adult, and honestly the most dignified thing I've seen him do. He set a boundary and then held it. The arrest, when it came, wasn't cinematic. Hannah got a Facebook message from a woman we didn't know whose dad dated Francine 15 years ago. "My friend works intake at the county jail. Your mother's in." She'd been picked up on the warrant trying to renew her license. The DA called to confirm he had our statements. Later we learned she pled not guilty and someone we've never heard of posted bond. It doesn't fix what she did. Court moves like wet cement and there's always the chance she talks her way around it again. But having a date on a docket and a case number you can look up makes consequences feel less like a fairy tale. We're still missing things. There are photos that will never come back. My dad's retirement is a puzzle with half the pieces chewed by a dog. I went alone to the storage unit one afternoon and found my grandmother's rosary tangled in a pile of cheap necklaces, and I sat on the concrete floor and cried, not for a person this time, but for the careless way one person can shake everyone else's life loose and call it love or illness or fate. But not everything slipped away. The bank voided the fraudulent mortgage. A title company ate fees I didn't know title companies ever eat. My dad's car, sold to one of her cousins, got impounded when the cousin never registered it. He got it back with a dent and a dead battery and the same cassette stuck in the player that my grandmother used to hum along to. He drove that car to my pinning ceremony. I finished clinicals. I took a job on a pediatric oncology unit 2 hours from home. On pinning day, I wore my grandmother's ring and let Vanessa pin me while Leo kept a hand on my elbow so I didn't shake. My dad sat with Hannah and clapped like he was trying to clap out every bad thing that happened this year. We ate takeout on the floor of my empty apartment, low main out of cartons with the little metal handles, and my dad said, "I want you to have one day where you do what you do and you don't think about her," and, for once, I didn't. This week I held a 12-year-old's chart and watched his mother braid his hair before radiation, and there was a tenderness in that room that made sense to me in a way nothing about Francine ever has. There's a court date now. Maybe 3 more after that. I don't know how her story ends. I do know that my dad signed a lease in his own name with no cosigner, that Hannah starts community college in January with a copy of my grandmother's picture in her wallet, that I bought my own health insurance and a second-hand couch and sleep without waiting for the other shoe to drop. When the unknown number calls come at weird hours and leave voicemails with long, theatrical breaths and a click, I forward them to the detective and then delete them from my phone. I don't leave space for her there anymore. Update 3. The grand jury returned a true bill on a Tuesday so bright it felt sarcastic. The DA said the words like he was reading a grocery list: scheme to defraud, grand larceny, possession of a forged instrument, criminal contempt for the late-night breathing voicemails. He told my dad he wouldn't have to face her if he didn't want to, that his affidavit and the paper trail were enough, but my dad put on his church shoes anyway and went to the courthouse with me and Hannah and sat under a clock that ticked too loud. When the clerk called her name, Francine walked in with a silk scarf tied just so and a surgical mask looped around one ear, like an understudy for a tragedy who hasn't learned the lines. She tried to make eye contact with Hannah. Hannah looked at the exit sign until the bailiff asked her to sit. The judge spoke softly, the way people speak to dogs that might bite. Bond conditions were a straight line: no contact, surrender passport, stay in state, no fundraising for medical conditions. She nodded like she'd invented boundaries and left without looking back. She lasted 6 days. The detective sent me a text with a single sentence: remanded. She'd called my dad from a number registered to a tanning salon in a town she wasn't supposed to be in, left a message about compassion fatigue and spiritual hospice, and then asked for the title to a car she'd forgotten. The judge didn't like that math. She went back in cuffs, her scarf in one hand. The day after she was picked up again, a search warrant cracked open a storage unit whose rent she'd stopped paying the same month she stopped paying the one Hannah dug through. We didn't go. The detective did. He called us from the parking lot and told us about Tupperware labeled Stage 2 and maintenance, about 3 wigs on styrofoam heads with post-its that said shorter for summer, about a Ziploc bag of hospital bracelets with barcodes from health fairs and 2 ER visits that ended with no acute findings. There were folders with donors' names and dollar amounts from the fundraisers, notes in the margin about who cried on the phone, who mentioned a mother, who would likely give again if asked kindly. There were signed sympathy cards she'd never mailed from people we love, stacked like a deck. In the bottom of a file box was a photocopy of the deed to the Catskills house with the notary stamp cut out like a postage stamp. The detective's voice did a thing it does when he's angry and trying not to show it. He said, "We'll catalog it, like a promise and a prayer." The healer sent the DA an email without being asked. "I'm ready to cooperate," he wrote, and attached receipts for energy balancing and tumor transmutation sessions and a photo of Francine in a bathrobe holding a coffee mug emblazoned with the phrase "chemo kills" in a kitchen I recognized from Facebook. He wrote that she told him her hair would fall out when it needed to, that she shaved it once for continuity, that she had a draft called My Miracle ready for the day she decided to get well. He handed them the backbone of her story and watched it stand without flesh. Court moved like weather. One morning was emotions hearing, all language and paper, and still my stomach went cold when the doors opened and she walked in with eyebrows penciled to the millimeter and a gray sweatsuit that wanted to be innocent. Her lawyer called what she did misjudgments under duress. The prosecutor called it theft and read the dates like beads on a rosary. My dad didn't look up. Hannah squeezed my wrist hard enough to leave half moons. When we left, a woman I didn't know was waiting on the steps with a tote bag and a photograph of a man with his arm around Francine 15 years ago, his eyes smiling and his wallet probably open. "She got me too," the woman said without drama. She gave the DA her name. I drove back to the hospital that night and took report on a 14-year-old with a port and a cat sticker on his chart. His older brother practiced how to fold a paper crane by watching a video on his phone and then did it without looking. Their mother took off her scarf and her hairline was blunt and new and honest. She said, "He didn't want me to shave it, but I told him hair is not the most interesting thing about me," and he laughed through his nose and looked exactly like a person who has never lied to a room. When he rang the bell after his last chemo, he clanged it so hard the plaque rattled and my pager went off and nobody cared because that sound is the only good loud noise in a hospital. Back home, real life kept inching forward like a parade you don't realize you're in until you're waving. Hannah started her classes and came home with a syllabus that made her cry because it was written in such plain hope: attendance policy, late work, a list of office hours like someone was waiting. My dad framed his lease and put it on the wall. He brings me groceries sometimes he can't really afford, eggs and a pineapple, because it looked happy. At the kitchen table, he wrote a victim impact statement with his reading glasses low and his tongue against his teeth the way he does when something matters. He didn't use words like ruin. He wrote, I stopped recognizing what a normal day felt like. He wrote, my daughter graduated anyway. The title company mailed an apology we didn't need and a check that won't fix anything and a letterhead that looks like a fresh sheet of snow. The AG's office sent a packet about restitution that read more like math than comfort, and still my dad set it on the counter like a talisman. At the next appearance, her lawyer floated a plea, time served, probation, an agreement to pay money she doesn't have over a schedule she won't keep. The DA said no. The judge ordered a psych eval not because anyone thinks she's sick in a way that excuses this, but because boxes have to be checked and this is how institutions work. When we filed out, Francine turned her head like she might say something to me, something old and sharp and probably rehearsed. I looked at the floor and counted the scuffs on the tile and thought about my patient's bell. I thought about my grandmother's hands turning pierogi dough the way you turn a problem you can't quite solve. Last weekend, my dad came over with onions and butter and that dented rolling pin my grandmother left in a drawer she thought no one would ever open. We argued about how big to make the circles, about how much filling is too much filling, about what to do with the weird shapes at the end. We ate the ugly one standing up at the stove. My phone buzzed on the counter. An unknown number left a voicemail full of air and an exhale that tried to be a sentence. I forwarded it to the detective. I deleted it from my phone. We kept eating. There's a trial date now, carved into a calendar where birthdays and oil changes and flu shots also live. She'll either fold or she won't. It doesn't touch the quiet ways things have started to lift. Hannah brought home a flyer for a campus blood drive and stuck it on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a cow. My dad hums when he shaves. I slept through my alarm yesterday for the first time in years and woke up laughing because the world didn't end. If she's building a new story somewhere, she's building it without us. The air in our house is just air. It smells like butter and dish soap and pineapple, not like panic. And when I walk into work and straighten a blanket on a kid who is fighting a real thing with every good part of himself, I know what I'm looking at. I know what I'm not. Update 4. Trial didn't feel like TV. It felt like the DMV with higher ceilings, stale coffee, humming lights, a copier somewhere that wouldn't stop beeping. My dad wore the same church shoes that pinch his little toe and brought the pen my grandmother used to sign birthday cards. Hannah had her hair in a braid she kept unbraiding and rebraiding until the rubber band gave up. When they brought Francine in, she had a hospital bracelet on like a costume piece and a knit cap that still had a price tag thread poking out. She tried to meet the room with the face she uses in mirrors, poised, put upon, sainted by other people's lack of belief. The bailiff's face didn't change. They set the evidence table with objects I recognized better than I wanted to: the Tupperware, the wigs on styrofoam heads, the manila folders with donors' names, the photocopied deed with a rectangle cutout where the notary seal used to be. It arranged itself into a shape you couldn't call anything but a life's work. The prosecutor didn't touch the wigs. He let them stare their blank mannequin stare toward the gallery, and I watched the jury follow their gaze like they were meeting three polite ghosts. Francine made it 10 minutes into openings before she did the thing we knew was coming. She reached for her throat with 2 trembling fingers and said she couldn't breathe, that the perfume in the room was triggering a neoplastic episode. The judge didn't sigh. He hit a button under the bench. 2 EMTs came in with a bag and the kind of walk people have when they've seen this exact trick 12 times. One took her pulse and said a number out loud. One pointed to the air vent, the way you point to the weather. They gave her water from a paper cone cup and she drank it, because of course she could. Hannah's hand loosened around mine at the same time my father's shoulders dropped, and that small sink felt like a vow. It didn't end with a cross-examination that unraveled her or a speech from anyone. It ended with her lawyer leaning over and whispering and her mask snagging on her left earring as she turned to nod. Your Honor, my client wishes to change her plea. The words collapsed the day like someone pulled a plug. She admitted to the counts they could prove cleanly: scheme to defraud, possession of a forged instrument, grand larceny above a number that makes you dizzy if you hold it too long, criminal contempt for the phone calls where she breathed like she expected us to translate her air. The judge asked her a set of questions as old as courtrooms. Did you do these things? Do you understand what you're giving up? Are you pleading guilty because you are guilty? Yes, 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 she said, her voice smooth as the inside of a shell. Sentencing would be in 6 weeks. A pre-sentence report would be prepared. She was remanded. Her scarf went with her, balled in her fist. The wig stayed on the table under a piece of blue painter's tape with a number on it. The week after the plea, the victim liaison called my dad and used words like allocation and restitution and you have the right to speak. He wrote at the kitchen table with his reading glasses sliding down his nose, the same place he does crossword puzzles with a pen because he says a pencil is an apology before you've made a mistake. He didn't ask me what to say. He wrote about grocery lists and credit alerts and waking up every night at 3 with his chest tight. He wrote about driving to my pinning in his old car with the dead battery resurrected and the cassette my grandmother loved rattling in the deck. He didn't write the word forgiveness. He wrote, "I would like a normal day." Hannah turned in a typed page that started with her name and student ID at the top because that's how she's learned to tell the truth lately, in formats with headings and margins that can hold it. She wrote about juice she wasn't allowed to drink, about a lock with a broken key, about not being sure for years if hunger was a moral failing. She wrote, "I am a person," and slid the paper into a manila envelope like she was mailing herself to a future address. Work made a shape around all of it. The unit smelled like bleach and apple juice and the faint wax of crayons. A little boy stuck dinosaur stickers to my ID badge while I assessed his line and told me which were herbivores with the seriousness of a graduate seminar. A teenager with glitter nail polish asked me if her eyebrows were even enough to be legal, and her mother laughed and cried at the same time and let her draw the last hair in. A boy rang the bell and then rang it again because once wasn't enough and the echo made the whole hall sound like it was agreeing with him. Between court dates, normal life refused to sit in the corner quietly. My dad fixed the drip under my sink twice because he didn't trust the first fix and now it doesn't drip, it sings. Hannah got an A on a paper about photosynthesis and taped it to the refrigerator with the cow magnet like anyone else in a house that isn't waiting for a knock. On a Saturday, we went to an estate sale in a house with floral carpet and bought a lamp shaped like a heron because the price tag said $5 and the woman running the cash box said she'd thrown in the light bulb for free. In the car, my dad asked if a lamp could look relieved. 2 days before sentencing, an envelope showed up with Francine's handwriting on it. The return address was her cousin's. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 sentences templated within an inch of their lives. "I am sorry for any pain my illness brought to you," she wrote, as if disease had reached out with nimble, forged fingers. "Please consider compassion." I put it under the magnet with the blood drive flyer and then took it down and put it in a Ziploc because the detective said keep everything. I stood at the sink and washed a spoon and said out loud, to my empty kitchen, "I consider the better air." Sentencing day was colder than the sky admitted. My dad wore the church shoes and thick socks. Hannah wore the bracelet our grandmother gave her when she turned 16. I wore my badge clipped to my pocket because some talismans have barcodes. The courtroom was fuller than it had been. The ex-husband she owed money to sat 2 rows behind us and stared at the table like the table might explain itself. The woman from the courthouse steps with the tote bag in the 15 years ago photo sat on the aisle with her mouth a tight, white line. The judge read the report without drama. He took a long breath as if to make room in his chest for what he was about to say. He talked about pattern and planning and the violence of a lie that asks other people to feed it. He called the wigs by their exhibit numbers and then by their names as objects. He said, "You are not sick," and it sounded like a diagnosis that finally stuck. The sentence wasn't a movie, either. Years, some locked, some watched. Restitution that will be math long after anyone wants to do it. A permanent order of protection. A prohibition on fundraising in her name or for her conditions, present or future. Mandatory counseling that won't work if what she wants is a stage. When he asked if she had anything to say, she said something about narrative, about trauma, about a childhood story she's told so many times it has lacquer on it. The judge let the words pass without collecting any. My dad read his statement, voice steady in a way it hasn't been in years. He did not look at her. He said, "I want my mornings back," and then he stood still and the stillness was a kind of standing ovation. Hannah read hers and then sat down and put her head in my shoulder and let herself be exactly 18 for 30 quiet seconds. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. There are things you don't say because you've already built a life that says them. After, the wigs went back in their boxes. A court officer, younger than me, carried one past us and looked sorry like he'd just closed a book on a bad ending and still wished the author had landed it differently. Outside, it had snowed the way it does when you didn't check the forecast. We stood under the overhang and watched the flakes make the concrete look deliberate. The woman with the tote bag lit a cigarette and then didn't smoke it, just watched it burn to the filter like a timer she didn't set. She said, "I feel silly." I said, "Me too." We exchanged numbers and she tucked mine into her wallet behind what I'm guessing is a grocery store loyalty card. Ordinary and extraordinary lived next to each other without screaming. The weirdest epilogue came by email. The healer, the energy worker, sent the DA another document. He'd published an apology on his website, a paragraph shaped like penance, and included an invoice to the state for the support hours he'd given to the investigation. The detective forwarded it to me with no text, just the attachment, and I laughed so hard I scared my cat. Later, a postal inspector called my dad about a separate investigation because one of her fundraisers had used old-fashioned mailers with return envelopes. He said, "I can't promise anything, but I can promise we saw it, Mr. W." My dad said, "Thank you," like he was ordering coffee, and his voice didn't shake. He hung up and went back to scraping the last of the pierogi filling out of the bowl with a piece of bread, economizing something small and good because he can. We drove home slow because the roads were slick and because we weren't in a hurry to get anywhere. At a red light, Hannah rolled down the window and stuck her hand into the snow and then rolled it back up and blew on her fingers like she hadn't done that since she was 9. My dad hummed something I half recognized and he knows better than to say it out loud. "We are okay." I went to work the next morning in a world that didn't crack from being looked at. The air in our house is still just air. It smells like laundry and the onion we didn't wrap up tight enough. The lamp shaped like a heron is ridiculous and maybe my favorite thing we own. On the fridge, the cow magnet holds the blood-dry flyer next to the photograph of me in white shoes holding a candle, next to Hannah's next to a sticky note in my grandmother's handwriting that says, "Don't forget butter." A voicemail came from an unknown number 2 nights ago at 2:18 a.m. I didn't listen to it. I forwarded it. I deleted it. I fell back asleep. In the morning, my dad texted me a picture of a pineapple he bought on sale with the caption, "This one looks hopeful," and it did. It looked like summer pretending to be inside winter. It looked like something that would be cut open and shared. It looked like a normal day, which is all I wanted when this started and, embarrassingly, more than enough. Update 5. A robot voice called me at 4:12 a.m. like an appliance had learned to gossip. This is a notification from the Victim Information and Notification Everyday System, it said in a tone that sounded like an elevator. The offender, Francine, last name, has been transferred. The facility name clanged around my kitchen like a dropped saucepan. I let the message finish and didn't write it down. When the sun showed up, my dad made eggs he oversalted and said, "I don't need to know where she sleeps," and then, because habits don't rewire overnight, he wrote the address on the back of a grocery receipt and put it in the junk drawer under a rubber band ball that looks like a planet. The detective texted me a week later, "Property release day." The email said chain of custody like a spell. The room was colder than it needed to be and smelled like dust that had been organized into folders. An officer with eyebrows too earnest for his job slid a plastic bin across a counter like a pizza no one wanted. It was a puzzle of our lives in sizes they could catalog, Ziplocs of bracelets and keys, the fake deed, a pack of photos with faces turned toward parties that never happened for us. At the bottom, under a tangle of extension cords and a single mitten like a joke, was a thin blue envelope that knew its own weight. My name on the front and my grandmother's careful print, the capital M she made with a little loop at the top like it was waving. The postmark was 3 winters ago. The flap hadn't been opened. I was suddenly, fully aware of the skin on my face. I sat down on a plastic chair that squealed and opened it with the kind of gentleness that makes you look ridiculous. Inside was a card with a painting of a bowl of lemons, and inside that a note about nothing important, store brand butter is fine, take a jacket, don't forget the bobby pins, routinely miraculous stuff, and tucked like a secret between the crease was a recipe card in her handwriting for pierogi dough with the word patience underlined twice as if it was an ingredient you could measure with a cup. It smelled faintly like the drawer she used to keep recipes in. I handed it to my dad. He held it with both hands like he was afraid it might float. 2 days after that, the notary from Florida whose stamp was Swiss cheesed out of our fake deed popped up in a news link a stranger sent Hannah. Local notary pleads to forgery scheme, the headline said with the same fonts they used to announce community theater. There was a photograph of a black rectangle where a face should have been, a door to some office park, a quote from someone saying they never suspected anything, which is always true until it isn't. The ADA forwarded us the docket number like the way you kick one more domino just to make sure the line doesn't stop. The healer, God help me, that man, tried to pivot faster than an office chair. His website changed overnight to a beige page with butterflies and disclaimers, for entertainment only stamped like a temporary tattoo across every promise. He sent the AG's office another email with an invoice attached and the words pro bono accrual and a screenshot of a Venmo request he'd sent to the state. The AG wrote back, "We do not pay criminals," and then my favorite sentence ever typed by a government, "Please do not contact this office again unless compelled by subpoena." The detective sent us a picture of that one. "For morale," he wrote, and even on a cracked iPhone screen, the bureaucratic smackdown glowed. Restitution arrived like a joke, a check for $14.38 mailed in a window envelope with my dad's name spelled right and the memo line printed in a font that wants to be brave, offender wages. He stood over the trash can and laughed without smiling. We taped the check to the inside of a cabinet door with blue painter's tape and closed the door. "We'll cash it," he said, "but not today." Later there were 2 more for amounts that wouldn't tip a waitress. It's all math we never asked to learn. Hannah finished her first semester and set a GPA on the fridge with the cow magnet between the blood-dry flyer and my grandmother's sticky note. She went on a date with a boy from her English class who has a forearm tattoo of a paper airplane pointed at his wrist. He picked her up in a car full of empty LaCroix cans and said hi, Mr. W, to my dad like it wasn't a test. When she got home at 10:03, she leaned on the counter and said, "He asked if I'm allergic to anything," and then she laughed until she cried like she'd just discovered a new shape her face could make. On a Sunday with thin sun and a breeze that had nothing to prove, we drove past the Catskills house because my dad said he wanted to see where his name had lived without him. GPS took us up a road that turned into a guess and then into dirt. The house was a gash of beige with vinyl siding and a for sale sign crooked like a loose tooth. A plastic flamingo stood in a patch of mud like it had refused to migrate. We didn't get out. We didn't take a picture. My dad put the car in park and put his hands at 10 and 2 like he was in a state-mandated instructional video and said, "There it is," and then, after a minute, "Okay." We turned around and stopped at a diner with a pie case that rotated slowly like a planetarium for sugar. Our waitress called us Han in a way that wasn't performative. My dad ordered meatloaf and asked for extra gravy and then asked for more napkins and then asked if he could take the little bottle of hot sauce because the label made him laugh. The woman with the tote bag from the courthouse sat 2 booths over with a man who might be her brother. We didn't say hello in case hellos are like wishes and you shouldn't spend too many in one day. I am making a life that includes the hospital and also other rooms. A 5-year-old with a dinosaur 4 cover roared at me while I adjusted his meds and then apologized and asked if I was afraid. I said no and he said good because you're the tallest person I know, and then he asked if tall people can feel rain first. A teenager wrote a college essay draft in bed 3 that made me cry in the med room where we hide the good tape. A little girl in pink Crocs lined her stuffed animals on the windowsill facing the ambulance bay so they could practice being brave and I wrote that line down on my hand and then realized I didn't need to because it was permanent now. An email pinged from the victim liaison with a subject that looked like a shrug, post-sentencing administrative conditions. She attached a PDF that read like a manual for a machine I didn't ask to build. There were dates we didn't have to go to, forms we didn't have to fill out, options we could check if we wanted to know when parole was a theory instead of a door. I checked the boxes without thinking and then unchecked one. I don't need the robot voice to tell me every time a gate opens and shuts. Some doors should close without an audience. Dad brought home a dog in a way that made sense. He went to the shelter to look and came back with 30 pounds of black and white punctuation that answers to Olive when she feels like it. She sleeps with her chin on his shoe like she's clocked in. The first time the doorbell rang, she barked and then wagged and then sneezed twice in a row and you would have thought she invented joy. He called me to ask what dogs can eat and then sent a video of Olive sitting while he cut a pineapple into half moons. She likes the smell but not the taste, he narrated like a nature documentary. Relatable, I texted back. A letter showed up from prison written on paper that looked like the inside of a cigarette pack. Not from Francine, her sister, who I haven't seen since a Christmas where someone burned the rolls. The letter said sorry in a way that meant I don't know what else to do with the fact that I am related to her. It included a photograph of Francine at 19 in a red coat with a cigarette and a look that says she'd already used up other people's chances. I put the picture in a drawer and then took it back out and stuck it under the heron lamp because refusing to pretend she didn't exist feels different than feeding the story she wanted. I can hold and not honor. That's a new skill, like a handstand you learn against a wall first and then eventually trust the air. There are still surprise bills and calls with hold music that sound like the inside of a mall in 2004. There's a civil suit a donor file that has my dad's name on one page because it has 2. There are nights my phone lights up with an unknown number and I feel a sting like a syringe under the skin before I remember I'm allowed to let it ring. But there are also Tuesdays where nothing happens except Hannah's lab partner brings a bag of clementines and leaves one on our porch shaped like a heart because she mispacked and we live close and she's that kind of person. Last night we made the pierogi from my grandmother's card and messed them up exactly right, some too full, some collapsed like they were fainting for effect. We ate the ugly ones first at the stove because they felt honest. My dad said the dough was softer than he remembered and we read the recipe again and realized she wrote rest as needed and we all laughed like we'd been given a permission slip. Olive watched the whole time with the patience of a saint and then fell asleep with her nose on the rolling pin's handle. I washed the last pan and put it upside down to dry and the heron lamp reflected in the water like a bird considering flight. An unknown number called at 1:53 a.m. I rolled over, let it finish, and didn't listen. I woke up to a picture of a pineapple on our group text, my dad's thumb in the corner of the frame like a signature. 2 for 5, the caption said. The skin was a little green, like it had a future. I put coffee in the machine and it made the sound I'm starting to believe is just coffee and not some warning disguised as an appliance. The air in our house stayed air. Our mornings are almost back, and on the days they aren't, they're close enough that you can lean and touch them.